Reasons that include the questions we'll ask and the conclusions we'll reach. So the first question I want to ask is, what would it take to replace Darwin? And by Darwin, I don't mean the man himself, I mean his ideas. So one of his most controversial ideas is that all of life on this planet is related, that you and I are related to one another, but not just to one another, that some of our cousins include the trees outside, the bacteria in this room that you can't even see, the chimpanzees, the great apes, on and on. That's what Darwin says. All of this is related. And Darwin said these relationships arose not by God causing them to be so, but by natural processes over millions of years. That's the idea I'm talking about. What would it take to replace that? And the reason it's controversial, or I should say, one of the reasons I know it's controversial is because reporters usually ask me a question when they find out that I'm a creationist and that I reject this idea. They say, well, you know that 97% of the scientific community disagrees with you. And those statistics are true. If you look at what the Pew Forum has done over many years and surveyed both the general public and the scientific community, the numbers are pretty stark. While in the general public there tends to be a consistent pocket of creationists, in the scientific community the numbers are very different. 97% would say evolution is true. So these reporters will say, well, what do you do with that? And they'll give me two options. They say, so if you're a creationist and you want people to believe that too, does that mean we have to either throw out science entirely or say there's some sort of vast conspiracy that 97 out of 100 scientists are somehow hiding the key evidence? So which of these two unpleasant, unpalatable options will you pick? Pick your poison, basically. What do you think the answer is? What options are there? I respond by saying, well, there's a third option. There's more than a third option. There's a fourth and fifth. There are other ways to look at this question, and it may surprise you to know that one of the options comes from perhaps an unlikely source. This isn't the first time we've faced statistics that are this stark. This isn't the first time in history where there's been a scientific consensus and a small group of people challenging it. One of the most recent situations that mirrors this goes back to Darwin himself. When Darwin came along, he didn't come along and be a hero solving a scientific mystery that had been unsolved for centuries. He came along and challenged the scientific consensus. He said so himself in his book. In the first edition that he published in 1859, his book On the Origin of Species, he preemptively asked a question. He knew his critics were going to ask this question, so he put it in print himself first. Darwin said, why, it may be asked, have all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists rejected this view of the mutability of species? So the mutability is change. In 1859, or pre-1859, people viewed species as unchanging. So Darwin says, why have all the well-known scientists rejected what I have said? And he asked that question so that he could answer it in his book. And he gave 4 responses. The first response was to review the evidence that he had just given in his book. So this particular sentence I just showed you is in the closing chapter of his book. The first response he gave was to say, well, let's review what I've just covered in the preceding chapters. How could you think any different? That was his first response. The second response, and these get really interesting for me, particularly considering that Darwin lived in Victorian England, he said, let's consider the time scale of human psychology. How long or slow does it take people to alter their view? He said, we are always slow in admitting any great change of which we do not see the intermediate steps. And we all know this is to be true. If there's a dominant idea that we hold to or that someone else holds to, and then the opposite view comes along, people don't quickly switch. You have to create a clear bridge from here to here so that they can walk across it. And even if you can connect these in a series of steps so that they can see, oh, I was wrong, I should be thinking this, they're still slow in doing so. Just look at today's polarized political climate. People aren't trying to talk and find bridges. They're very entrenched. They're very slow in changing their mind. Darwin said the same thing held true back then. So he's proposing something new. People are going to be slow to accept it. His third response, and this is perhaps the most entertaining to me, is to consider the obstinacy of human psychology. This is what Darwin said. I by no means expect to convince experienced naturalists whose minds are stocked with a multitude of facts, all viewed during a long course of years from a point of view directly opposite to mine. In other words, to put it in modern English, some old dogs don't learn new tricks. That's basically what he said, and he got away with it. There are some people who are just not going to change their mind. He wasn't trying to convert them. Instead, he said, I look with confidence to the future, to young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality. That's what he said, 1859, in response to those who said, well, you're challenging the consensus. How can you do that? The fourth response was to point out the contradictions in the opposing views. And it appears that this four-part strategy was wildly successful. And again, his book bears out this fact. This, again, is the 1859 quote from the first edition of his book. By 1861, this sentence changed as he updated it. He said, Wyatt may be asked, have nearly all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists rejected his view? So by 2 years later, there was already a crack developing in the scientific consensus. And 10 years after the first edition, the 1869 edition, the sentence had changed to this. Wyatt may be asked, until recently, did nearly all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists reject his view. So in 10 years, Darwin flipped the scientific consensus. They totally rejected him in 1859. They embraced him in 1869. So could there be a good basis for challenging the scientific consensus today? I think we can take a page from this strategy. I would argue, first of all, and I'll go backwards through his arguments for a reason I'll explain in a moment, I would say evolution has contradictions. Now, if you don't agree with that, you don't have to take my word for it. I'll just give that a different color on the screen as a proposition to be tested. Has human psychology changed in 150 years? Are people less obstinate today than they were back then? My impression is humans are the same. People are still very, very unlikely to change their views. They take a long time to think of something different. That's helpful. If we flapped in the breeze, so to speak, and went from one thing to another, it'd be a very different existence that we have. What I want to do in the time we have remaining is do what Darwin did, and is review the evidence. Now, I haven't given you a book that we can review, but there's been 150 years since he wrote his book, and I want to review what has happened. So this will be a little bit of a history lesson, some history perhaps that you haven't heard, that I think give us good reason to revisit the question of evolution, good reason to confront the scientific community, the 97%, and say, is it time to replace him? So what I want to do is give you two reasons that I think we have to doubt Darwin, and then at the end talk about why I think we can even go so far as to replace him. So I want to talk about what species are. Darwin wrote a book on the origin of species. If we're going to replace this, we have to have something said about species. I want to talk about what species are, the history of species, and then think deeply about their fundamental nature. And along the way, I think we'll discover some very profound reasons, some very simple but very profound reasons why it's time to rethink this issue, scientifically. So what's a species? I have this textbook, Speciation by Jerry Coyne and Alan Orr, on my desk. Very helpful textbook. It's to evolutionists. Very helpful discussion of what species are, why there are species, and the latest research in that field. And this is many years old, but still a helpful resource. They list 9 different definitions for species.